After studying the philosophy of consciousness for my entire adult life, and after learning and experiencing the most extraordinary things, the most important lesson I've learned to this date is this. A religion, in its most accurate and authentic form, has an ontological basis of neutral monism. This is because every time we have a question about consciousness or reality, the answer is always based in neutral monism, because that's the ontology that makes sense. It doesn't leave any more questions. This is always true in spite of that religion having particular dualist beliefs, which of course contradict everything within that religion. This is always true in spite of that religion involving people with dualist views of the religion itself. There are always people with a dualist outlook because most people are not taught the fundamentals or taught to think about the fundamentals. The scholars, however, are usually monist most of the time. And if they don't explicitly say that the answer is monism, their answer is pretty much always a monist answer. I'm talking about the ontological positions of dualism and neutral monism, not duality or monotheism or anything else, just to be clear. So this applies to every religion. It's always the same story. Right now, I will show you just one example of this in Buddhism. I will read a short excerpt from the Robert Buswell Encyclopedia of Buddhism. I think this is starting on page 207. Rebirth and the problem of no self. The Buddhist doctrine of rebirth differs fundamentally from the idea generally upheld in Hinduism and Jainism, both of which accept the existence of an eternal and substantial self or soul that transmigrates from life to life. Buddhism, by contrast, rejects the notion of an absolute self. Fundamental to its understanding of rebirth is the doctrine of no self, the idea that in samsara, which is forever in flux, impermanent, and constantly changing, there can be no permanent, unchanging, independent self or soul. Basically, this is just reiterating what I just said, which is the idea of reincarnation is dualist, because the soul, what you're talking about, the soul has to be like a ghost that goes from point A to point B. That's dualist, even though the doctrine of no self is monist, and they contradict each other. But if there is no absolute self, how does Buddhism resolve the problem of transmigration and of the continuity of karma between one life and the next? The early Buddhist schools in India offered a variety of responses to this conundrum. One school went so far as to propose the concept of an inexpressible personal entity that traveled from life to life, a concept that seemed to contradict the fundamental tenet of no self. Other schools posited the existence of an ethereal entity composed of subtle forms of the five aggregates that passed through an intermediate state between death and the next birth. In the early period of Buddhism in India, concepts like these were subjects of much controversy. Not all the schools accepted such ideas. One, for example, denied the existence of an intermediate state and argued instead for the existence of an inactive mode of deep consciousness that forms a causal link between one life and the next. In this view, the first moment of consciousness in a new birth is simply the direct conditioned effect of the final moment of consciousness of the immediately previous existence. So what is this saying? Basically, this is saying that the concept of no self and the concept of reincarnation contradict each other, because no self is monist and reincarnation is dualist. So a bunch of people are coming up with solutions, or trying to. And these solutions don't work because all of their analyses, all of their interpretations of the dualist reincarnation are all dualist. They still don't work because all of their ideas are dualist. And in this paragraph, this idea denied the existence of an intermediate state and argued instead for the existence of an inactive mode of deep consciousness. So, what does inactive mean? What does that mean? What does it mean by mode? What does it mean by deep consciousness? See, they're just trying to use mental gymnastics and keep their dualist ideas, and it doesn't work. So let's go to the next one. Rebirth and cosmic causality. In basic Buddhist doctrinal terms, an answer to the difficult question of rebirth in light of the cardinal teaching of no self is to be located in how Buddhism understands causality, the way one thing leads to another. One Buddhist formula describes it as follows: when this exists, that exists. From this arising, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not exist. From this ceasing, that ceases. Technically speaking, this principle of causality is explicated by the formal doctrine of dependent origination, which holds that all phenomena, including the self and the surrounding world, arise out of a network of relationships dependent upon other causes and conditions. The self, therefore, is not to be understood as an essential, independent entity moving from one life to the next, but rather as a manifestation of a complex of causes and conditions, both mental and physical, themselves interdependent and continually in flux. So basically they're saying that your soul is not a ghost that moves from point A to point B. And so causality is really important in this this contradiction in ontology. Causality is very important. So in this quote, when this exists, that exists, basically what this means in more common language, a more clear language, it means that when your brain exists, your consciousness exists. That's basically what it means. Another way to say that is that when you're dead, your consciousness isn't floating out there, or it's not traveling from one place to another. The only time there's consciousness is when there's a body having that consciousness. So that's the causality part. The doctrine of dependent origination is graphically depicted as a circular chain consisting of 12 conditioned and conditioning links. This paragraph I'm going to skip, but you can read it if you want. Okay. Birth and death, then, are to be understood as nothing more or less than oscillating links in the ongoing chain of cause and effect. Rebirth is a configuration of a new cluster of causes and conditions propelled by previous karmic impulses. The process is compared to lighting one candle with the flame of another. The former flame is not the same as the latter, and yet there is still a transfer of the flame. Like lighting a new candle, rebirth is simply the movement of a continuum of ever-changing mental and physical complexes from one physical support to another. It is this particular notion of causality that lies at the heart of the Buddhist understanding of rebirth. So, this is an analogy. They're calling the flame of a candle consciousness. It's an analogy for consciousness. So what does that mean in consciousness terms? They're basically saying that consciousness is like the existence of flame itself. It's not this flame or that flame, it's just the existence of flame. If there's flame somewhere, then there's flame somewhere. You can't pinpoint which flame is which. It just exists. And so that's the monist solution to the dualist idea of reincarnation. Basically, what I'm saying is that the idea of reincarnation is not dualist, meaning you do not have a soul which is a ghost that travels from point A to point B in space and time. That's not how it works. And this might be going a little bit too far, but that basically means that the idea of reincarnation basically is meaningless. At least the idea that you and I have been raised to understand, the idea of reincarnation as a dualist idea, it doesn't exist. And these are Buddhist scholars saying this. There's a contradiction. The Buddhist scholars, this isn't me saying this, the Buddhist scholars are giving a solution which is ontologically monist. The reason it's a solution is because the solution is based in the ontology called neutral monism. The engine of rebirth is karma, the good and bad actions of body, speech, and mind that have been performed not only in the immediately preceding life, but also many lifetimes ago. The cumulative moral quality of a person's karma determines the quality of each successive life. There is widespread consensus among Buddhists everywhere, however, that the state of a person's mind at the moment of death can actually be the most significant factor. Alright, yeah, and then they go on and say that you can pay money to have a better reincarnation or something, which is kind of like Catholicism. So basically, what this means is that the karma is not based on your actions or your decisions alone, and it's not simply you that are reincarnating into another body. It's a lot of different people in a lot of different times. I would argue that it's everyone and everything adding to the pool of karma, if you will. I don't believe in karma because I'm not a Buddhist, but that's, if I was a Buddhist, a monist Buddhist, then that's what I would say. So in Wikipedia, here's a passage I found on the Buddhism page. It says, the Buddha introduced the concept that there is no permanent self, and this central concept in Buddhism is called anatta. Major contemporary Buddhist traditions accept the teaching of Buddha. These teachings assert there is rebirth, there is no permanent self, and no irreducible soul, moving from life to another and tying these lives together. There is impermanence, that all compounded things, such as living beings, are aggregates, dissolve at death, but every being reincarnates. So, what I'm saying is repeated on the Wikipedia page of Buddhism. You can think I'm full of it all you want, but this is what is going on in the religion called Buddhism, and I'm merely reporting on it. So this is just one example. This is just one religion, but every religion is like this. Every religion is essentially monist, but within the religion there are one or two things that are like totally dualist, and they contradict everything else in the religion. And when the scholars of that religion come up with the solution, it's always that, well, no, that idea isn't actually dualist, it's monist. And they give it a monist interpretation. So that's that.